The Godmother, Griselda Blanco.
Pablo Escobar and a few of the great Colombian kingpins had so much power that they had politicians and police and the federal police on his payroll. They think they're invincible. I've always viewed Griselda Blanco as a person who was willing to do anything, no matter how brutal, to keep her power. She was ruthless about that. If you asked her to spare my life, oh, please, it's my family, or whatever else, she wasn't the likely one to say, oh, yeah, I'll give you a break. She didn't have DNA for sympathy. Griselda Blanco prompted the federal government's move into Miami. By the time she was eventually indicted, she was, according to the FBI, responsible for close to 200 murders in South Florida. One of the reasons that I so like Griselda Blanco de Trujillo is she shows you where women's rights are. You think there isn't a woman who can compete in the tough and rough world of drug dealing? Go and look at Griselda and she'll straighten you out very quickly on that. Miami deserved the reputation that it got as the center of cocaine in North America. Colombians were able to get it from the source, get coke very, very cheap, and bring it in ever larger quantities into Miami, where it then became a distribution point for the Northeast and the West Coast. One of the stories told about her often is that at 11, she was involved in the kidnapping of a wealthy kid from the flatlands next door to the poor neighborhood hills she was involved in, and shot the kid herself. Whether true or not, the key is that that became part of her legend. So that later, when she becomes the godmother, they're all thinking her as an 11-year-old killer. What does she do at 14? She leaves an abusive mother, as the story goes, and starts to turn tricks in Medellin. Then we lose her. Don't know where she is until the mid-1970s, when she moves to Forest Hills in New York, in Queens. Coke's time was the 70s and 80s, disco, the perfect period. There was a status to doing coke. If you really had style and you were happening and you had a reputation to keep up, you had coke. Coke was not done by street-level drug dealers. Coke was done by people who were partying, who were at the cutting edge of waiting in line to get into Studio 54. One of the reasons it fueled coke's popularity was the view that it wasn't dangerous. There was a general belief that it wasn't physiologically addictive, and it had no downside other than making you stuffy after a couple of days of use, and that all it did was like having the equivalent of 5 big Starbucks all at once. So what could be bad about that? You have shipments of hangers that are coming in that look as though they're wood, light wood, that can be put in plastic inside to hold up a suit jacket, but they're hollow, and inside of there are the drugs. Later, the DEA says they saw containers. The drugs were not inside the shipping containers. They were the shipping containers themselves. They were the walls and ceilings of the shipping containers, which were false, and that's how she was bringing the drugs in. 150 kilos of cocaine, which at that time, hard to believe, was a record. That was the biggest seizure ever. And what does she do? She flees to Colombia. Not surprisingly, she gets away, even though there's a standing warrant for her. And then what does she do next? You probably figure she stays in Colombia, that's the end of it, lays low. She says, you know what, Miami looks pretty good to me. She comes back to Miami under her real name with a national federal warrant out for her, and nobody puts two and two together. She sets up the most vicious drug gang from 1977 to 89 that ran in that time. Other dealers who were equally prominent got together and said, time to kill her. They tried 6 times. Kill her here. 6 different attempts on her life. You know what? She survived. People come to Miami Beach to party. They always have. It's Las Vegas without the gambling casinos. Feds believed that Griselda Blanco's organization was taking in $8 to $10 million a week. She had a collection of jewelry, millions of dollars, that she said some of the pieces came from Eva Perón. She liked dressing that way. She spent thousands of dollars a night at clubs in terms of champagne and money and bottles. So she was very much about the bling. She had an enforcement gang, Los Pistoleros, the shooters. They were the first in many areas. They were the first in their levels of brutality, and they were first in some of the methods they adopted. For instance, a drive-by on the back of a motorcycle. That was copied by drug gangs throughout South Florida afterwards. They said, great move. Those pistoleros, how did you get in, by the way? Did you go to see Griselda and say, I want to be a member? No. It was an initiation process. You had to kill someone. You had to take off their ear or chop off their finger. That was the method. This was their trademark. They would put a body into the bathtub. They would cut the body open and drain the blood out. They would then fold the body into a cardboard box and ship the box either to the family or to the head of the other cartel. Griselda knew from the beginning this was how you intimidated those who stood up against you. Ronald Reagan actually declared war on drugs in South Florida. Sent a special task force down, flooded this area with federal agents who said this is like throwing a dart at a board. This is the easiest thing we've ever seen to make arrests. Come on, they're all over here. The largest effort the federal government ever made in modern times to have to intervene in that a region, a city, an area, a county was out of control. There were so many ways that the system was being bought and manipulated that if the federal government had not come in as the cavalry, it wasn't going to get cleaned up. She became so bad for business because she was high profile and she was too violent that other dealers who were equally prominent got together and said, time to kill her. They tried 6 times to kill her here. Half a dozen different attempts on her life she survived. She started to spend more time in California where she was opening up a new distribution point. If you picked up the Miami Herald that day, front page, nothing. Page 2, 3, 4, nothing. Nothing in the Miami papers about her. The fact that she didn't make the Miami news is not really the fact that the journalists weren't good here. It's a sign of how many Griselda Blancos there were in Miami. There were so many players in the cocaine business, you needed a scorecard to keep track of them, and one was arrested. It wasn't news anymore. What are they doing back in Miami? Prosecutors here know what a lowlife she is. They want her back here for a trial. They're going to try to get her on a murder charge, death penalty in Florida. They have her under the Super Kingpin Act. They can put her away for life in prison, a pine box sentence. It's the equivalent of being in a pine box. You're never going to get out, and she gets 10 years.